Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Book Talk with Kara. I am so excited to have back my friend Jocelyn Green, and we are talking about her brand new book, The Hudson Collection. This cover, y'all, is so perfect for the book because it's this gothic type of mystery and a little bit of suspense and historical and 1920s. I mean, there's so much going on in this book. But before we dive into it, Jocelyn, why don't you take just a moment for those readers and listeners who haven't met you yet, just to explain a little bit about who you are and how you got into writing, and then we'll dive into the Hudson Collection.
Okay, sure. Well, thanks for having me back, Kara. It's always so fun to be here and to chat with you. Um, I am Jocelyn Green. I live here in Iowa with my husband and two teenagers, one of whom recently became an adult. So, navigating that new stage of parenting. I started writing nonfiction before I wrote novels. My husband was in the Coast Guard, so I started writing for and about military spouses, families, members. So I did a bunch of that. And then I started writing fiction, historical fiction, with kind of a military angle. So my first series was four books and set during the Civil War, Heroines Behind the Lines. And then I've just been writing ever since, and it's not necessarily all set during wars anymore. The book that we're going to be talking about today, the Hudson Collection, is set in 1925, 26. So it's between world wars, but a couple of the characters have, been in World War One and they are affected by it. But it's been really fun for me to write this series set in the 1920s. I've written as far back as 1720s, so this was a big jump for me, but the research is a lot easier when when it's set in the 1900s. So I've enjoyed that part a lot.
Yeah, and I love it because this book and the one before it, they're set kind of in the roaring 20s. Well, not kind of, they're very much set in the roaring 20s and in New York, kind of in that it's not the Gilded Age, it's fast forward to the flapper era and just this really time set between the wars when people want to be living this very fun, energetic life. And the first one is set in the era of everything Egypt, just this everything's very, very Egypt. But then with the Hudson Collection, it's still set back kind of in the museum era, but you're focusing on birds
Yes.
and dead birds.
Yeah,
How did you land on that? Because I don't know that I would have said, hey, I want to research all the dead birds.
I know. Well, in order to get to what is the book two in the series going to be about, it kind of stemmed from what is book one going to be about. And for that one, um, it's called The Metropolitan Affair. And the main character, Lauren, has a PhD in Egyptology, and she's an assistant curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And we chose that because we now are approaching the 100th, or we've passed the 100th anniversary of the opening of King Tut's tomb.
Yeah.
So that's why we started researching when we were plotting a series, look at historical anniversaries and what's coming up and what's interesting. So I knew I wanted to have an American female Egyptologist. And then we started thinking, well, how can we make this a series? Okay, let's have three friends, three roommates, and they all work in institutions set on Central Park. So the second one, we picked the American Museum of Natural History. And I was just kind of looking for an interesting occupation that I haven't done before for a main character, and ornithologist seemed like a good one, but also because I was looking at annual reports from the 1920s from this museum, and everyone who worked at this museum was male except for a female who worked in the ornithology department. And so
Okay.
that's kind of why I thought I could reasonably have a female staff person in ornithology, if in no other department.
That's so interesting. And that's one of the things I love about your books is you do all of this research. You can tell that you started out in nonfiction writing in the journalism sphere because you bring that attention to detail, that attention to research into your work. And so with the Metropolitan Affair, you're digging into all the Egyptology and just kind of the wave of fascination that swept through America and the world with the discovery of King Tut's tomb. And then now you've got, the Natural History Museum, and those are like never my favorite because seeing bones and stuff like that, I've always been like, ugh. But now you've got this main character, a heroine who she starts and like her first scene is really like working with these dead birds and stretching their skins and stuff. And I was like, what was the research like for
Yes.
that?
I was very excited to find a guide written by a staff person at the museum for how to skin and stuff birds.
I would not have wanted to read that. I love research, but
Yeah,
that might have been too far.
it was a lot. And this was the guide that they had actually, sent out for people who wanted to, if they captured birds and wanted to donate them to the museum. So like what they talk about in the book is something that really happened. And part of the reason I wanted to start with her doing that in the first scene, or almost doing it for squeamish readers, she doesn't actually cut anything. She gets very close and a
Mhm.
colleague walks in. And also, if
Yep.
you're squeamish about this, maybe you want to steer clear of my Civil War books because, you know, there are amputations worse than a bird skinning. Um, because I wanted to show that the character Elsa, she was really fascinated by birds from the time she was sick in bed with polio as a child because she didn't know if she could ever walk again. She would look out the window, she would see these birds in flight, and she would, be able to watch them at the feeders, and she loved them. So she always thought she would like to, have this job. She achieves her dream job, and then it kind of turns out to be not super cool because she loves living birds. And here she is working with dead birds. And it's a little like, I don't want to know if it's depressing, but it's not what she expected it to be. And that's kind of one of the themes of the book. Like what happens when your expectations aren't met and you achieve something and it turns out to be not what you thought it would be.
And that's so true to life. And I think so many of us have had that moment, if not once a week, at least at some point in our lives, where we're like, wait a minute, this is not at all what I expected. This isn't what I signed up for.
Mhm.
And what I also loved is you've got this juxtaposition where the heroine has a visible challenge because of her battle with polio, but then the hero and his friend have a hidden challenge because of their time in the war. And
Mhm.
so what we would now call PTSD, um, during World War One, they didn't know how to handle it and what to
No.
call it. And it's always kind of interesting to me because war's not new,
Right.
but suddenly for some reason after World War One, it's like we had this whole wave, and it must have been because of the way that the battles had evolved with warfare and things like that. There were so many more soldiers who were coming back and very visibly affected, or it was more in people's faces that there were all of these soldiers who had the lingering effects of PTSD.
Mhm.
And so you've woven that into the story, and it's happening years after World
Yeah.
War One has ended.
Right.
So why did you choose to weave that into the story?
Because I thought, with the war ending, it was a handful of years prior to my story being set in 1926. But for a veteran, I mean, that was the generation that would have gone
Mhm.
to war. And in my first book, I did not have a veteran of World War One in that, and I wanted to represent that. The hero Luke has visible scars on his face. He does not have PTSD, but I wanted a character who did struggle with that, so I gave him a roommate and assistant who struggled more with the tremors and the flashbacks and this startling noises and being disoriented and things like that. So I did mindfully pair Elsa with her polio limitations with these young men who knew what it was like to have limitations, or, something in their life changed them, who they are. And all of them in their own ways have to decide, is that what's going to define you? Or how can you overcome it? And also, I think it gives them more compassion for each other because they know what it's like to be different. And also, the 1920s was the peak of the eugenics movement in the United States. And so there was this whole quest for the ideal human product, which was really wild to think about and scary to think how far that went in America. And then you've got these characters who definitely wouldn't qualify as the ideal human product, whether it's because she's got a limp or, they've come back from war and they're physically disfigured a little bit, or they've got this condition that, they would say he's shell shocked, or, whatever. They didn't understand it at all. So to have these characters set during this historical time when there wasn't a lot of understanding, and there certainly wasn't any embracing really of people who were different outside of the norm.
Yeah, I think that was so interesting. And with the hero scarring, it reminded me a little bit of Beauty and the Beast as
Mm,
well. The way he kept hiding, he kept trying to
yeah,
hide his scars, whereas she's got the limp, but there's nothing she can do to hide it.
right.
And in every other way, she's fine.
Yeah.
She's normal, but polio has affected her. So when you think about the Hudson Collection, and there's all these different aspects and elements of it, you've got the birds, got the cows, you've got the challenge of finding this illuminated manuscript essentially, and identifying and going through all these birds that have been left to the museum, and just all the things going on. What was the most challenging part of writing this book?
I think the most challenging part was probably representing these characters that have things that I have not personally experienced. So I had to do a lot of research on polio and post polio syndrome, or whatever that's called, when, after you've recovered as well as you could, after a period of 15, 20 years, you start having more symptoms again. So that involved a lot of research and reading memoirs by people who had that. And of course, for the PTSD. And I've written a character in Veiled in Smoke. The character of Stephen was a father of the protagonist, and he had been a Civil War veteran. He had been at Andersonville. So he also, I have done a lot of research on this, but it's different after World War One. There's just, every war has its own
Yeah.
thing. And then we haven't even mentioned there's a 12-year-old character named
Yeah.
Danielle who today would be diagnosed on the autism spectrum. They didn't have that language back then. They didn't understand it. So representing her respectfully, realistically, sensitively was a big challenge. And I have to give a shout out to Pepper Basham, who partnered with me. She has years of experience working with kids like this. And so I, presented the scenarios, and she helped me, say, yes, that would have happened, or no, let's tweak it. And the dialogue, she helped tweak what I had, my first try, she helped tweak so that it was more realistic. So
I
very
love that.
thankful for all of the people and all the research for the characters.
That's awesome. Yeah, and Pepper would be such a great resource for that character, because as I was reading her, you could tell,
Mm,
that today she would be diagnosed on the spectrum, but yet it was done with such loving care that it was, she was a beautiful character. She was
mhm.
someone that you could really be like, oh, she's adding to the story. She's not a caricature at all. And it was just
Right.
so well done. So this book is one in a whole line of books that you've written, and it's not your last book. What's next for you? What are you working on now?
The next book would be book 3 in this On Central Park series. So we've had Lauren's story with the Metropolitan Affair. The Hudson Collection is Elsa's story. And the next book, currently untitled, is Ivy's story. So roommate number 3, and she's a lot of fun. So I'm having a fun time writing her story right now.
So can you tell us which museum she works at?
She works as a librarian in the New York Historical Society. So
Oh, Oh, that would be so fun. I can't
Yes,
wait.
and she's having a great time because in 1926, it's the 150th anniversary of the Revolutionary War. And so she's got like all these
Oh,
historical event things to attend and plan and do. And, she's a history nerd like me. So that's fun.
oh, that is going to be so much fun. And there was so much going on in that area during the Revolutionary War
Yes,
too.
New
So,
York State. Yep.
yeah.
Definitely.
Oh, so fun. So, when you think about your life and your writing journey and your writing career, what's one thing that you would go back and tell your younger self as you were contemplating starting the writing journey? What's one piece of advice you would go back and give yourself?
That's a really good question. I think I would. I would probably tell myself that just because it's hard doesn't mean I'm doing it wrong because it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard because it's hard.
Yeah.
It just is. And, I wrote my first novel, and every first novel is hard. And then the second novel you would think is easier. And, in some ways, a little bit, because you know a little bit more what to expect. But I've written several novels now,
Yeah.
and
It should be
it's
easier.
not easy. It's still not easy. So I think, in the beginning of your career, when you're realizing this isn't necessarily getting easier with every
Yeah.
book, don't have a crisis of, self-esteem. It's just hard because what we do is it's hard work.
Well, and I think that sometimes each book gets harder
Mm,
because you're trying to improve and surprise readers. And so
yeah.
it has to, everything gets more involved. And so,
And
and yet
there's
we
more
think
pressure,
it should
there's
get
more
easier.
expectations,
Yeah.
and we're the further along you get, I mean, when you're writing your first novel, you're not also promoting a novel that came out before it. And now we're promoting, we're writing, maybe editing, planning the
Yeah.
next novel, making sure that we're interacting on social media, sometimes less, sometimes more, and being involved in giveaways and campaigns. And there's a lot of ancillary activities to being an
Yeah.
author that you don't really realize when you're first starting out. So yeah, there is additional pressures on your time and your reputation as a writer. So,
Things like having to do podcast interviews, all the things.
but this is fun. This is fun.
So, what's your biggest challenge as an author?
Well, right now it's just finding the time to do it.
Yeah.
I started working full time outside the home in February, and up until then, I would just write when the kids are at school. And so now it's evenings, weekends, but evenings I'm pretty spent. So, but other than the time, rough drafts are my nemesis. I know like Laura France is in love with the rough draft and she just adores it and I despise it. Like it's such writing is such an isolating job or a
Yeah.
solitary job that until I can share it with an editor and get feedback and say, oh, that's what I was missing. I was just too close to it to understand what it needed. The revisions are more fun for me, but that first draft is just, ugh, it's not
Yeah.
all that enjoyable.
Yeah. There, because it is. It reaches a point where I'll always hit a point in the rough draft or the first draft where I'm like, okay, I've gotten it as good as I can get it. And usually I can identify one or two things when I'm sending it in for
Yep.
the macro edits where I'm like, okay, I know it's fat and sassy, or I know that there's not enough romance, or I know the spiritual thread needs to be pulled up, or whatever, but I don't know how to do it. I'm too close to it. But
Mm-hmm.
I can usually identify for the editor, here are probably the two things that you're going to say to me, but
Yes.
I have no idea how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So here you go.
Yes,
I'm open to your brilliant ideas because I'm stuck and I'm too
right.
close to it. I just got to turn it over and have fun.
Yep, I
Um,
do something similar at the end of every manuscript. I
yeah,
say known issues. I'm like,
yeah,
no, I have to work on these things. And then it makes me feel better if I'm the one to to point them out first. But I mean, it
exactly.
really is like a team effort, and we do work together to make it the best story it can be. So I do welcome
Yeah.
their brilliant suggestions.
Well, and I think, I don't know about you, but for me, I feel like I'm telling them, hey, I know it's not perfect. I understand where it needs some work. But like you, I'm like, but I'm at least identifying. I know something about what I'm doing. I
Yeah.
understand where it needs work. I just don't know how to get there. And
Yes.
so
Yep.
I don't know why that makes me feel better, but it does.
Makes
So
sense
it's
to me.
crazy. Yeah. But while it's a lot of work, you still do it. So
Mhm.
something about the process must bring you joy. So what does? What brings you joy in this
Um,
process?
I think a fulfilling story that surprises even me at the end. With every book, I ask myself, what is it that matters about this story? What is it that is going to matter for the reader? Because if nothing matters, I might as well go
Yeah.
do something else with my time. So it's finding that thread that I think will resonate with readers and working it and working it and working it until it's a story that I think I can be proud of and that is going to mean something to somebody else. I also really like seeing the covers. I love book
Yes.
covers. That's a fun moment, but that alone would not be enough to sustain this writing life. So it really is the stories. And also as a historical novelist, I haven't done contemporary. Um, I really like to highlight a piece of history that I think hasn't gotten very much attention in the past. And, writing Civil War books, like there's a million Civil War books,
Yeah.
but the angles of like these certain specific stories of what women were doing,
Mm.
that's something that I didn't learn in school. So being able to shed some light on something historical is always fun for me.
I love that. And I think that that's like when I write historical, that's what I love to do. Find those untold stories and bring attention to them. And like what you do with highlighting what women have done and the contributions they've made at different times. And, just bringing attention to these different aspects is so very important. And something that, when you bring that focus, but you're doing it in a way because you care so deeply about the history and getting it right. But then you're also a phenomenal storyteller. So it's not like we're sitting there reading a nonfiction tome that we're just like, oh my gosh, is it ever going to end? So that blending of the love of history with the love of story then creates these wonderful novels
Mm.
that just pull readers in. And you're so talented at that. It's just so much fun.
Oh, thank
And the
you.
Hudson Collection is definitely one of those. And the covers for this series are
Yeah.
just incredible.
Yeah, they are. They are. I just could not believe. I mean, both of them are so cool, but I mean, the little borders and this
I
time,
know.
I don't know if you
The
don't have one in your
birds.
hands. I don't know if you can tell, but birds, and this is kind of like a bird cage.
Yeah,
Bars of a bird cage, which is just so perfect and fun. So the cover designers have
are
really outdone
killing it.
themselves.
And her red dress, the papa
I
color,
know.
is
Yep.
just so fun.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Jocelyn. It is always just so much fun to chat with you and to learn more about your passion for your stories and the particular book that is coming out right now. Thank you. It's just always great.
Thank you for having me. Always fun to talk with you, Kara.